Hello again, friends. Here's Chapter 5 of In Dull Knife's Wake, entitled Cowboys, Dog Soldiers, and Crazy Englishmen by Vernon R. Maddux. Men who knew William C. Quinlan said he looked old at age 30. Billy, as he was called, together with his brothers, had established a cow camp on Spring Creek. He first arrived in the spring of 1877 after several years of hard scrabble cattle driving up from Texas. The Quinlan brothers were quite typical of the ranchers in the area. They were close-knit, blood-related, and were either from Texas or claimed to be. South of their pastures in Clark County was Day Creek, where Doc Day and Jess Driscoll's D-Cross Ranch had its headquarters. It was Quinlan's bad luck that Dull Knife led the women and children through his grazing area when the chief moved up Kyger Creek to the Big Basin. Of all the cattle companies in the path of the Cheyenne in either Kansas or Nebraska, Quinlan's was hit the hardest. 3 of his herders were killed, half of his complement of 6. One of his men, Samuel LaFleurs, left his bones in a grassy area 4 miles up Spring Creek, not far from Big Basin. Since he had been herding cattle on Little Sand Creek, he must have had a long-running fight before he died. In a Cheyenne raiders' camp on the north bank of the Cimarron, several miles south of where his body was discovered, searchers recognized his scalp near a burned-out campfire by the color of the hair. Parts of his clothing and other items known to have belonged to him lay near an ash heap. Between September 12 and 14, Conrad, LaFleurs, Dow, Evans, and Richardson were killed in Clark County and near the border of Comanche County. It was probably a completely different group of Cheyenne who attacked the dugouts along the Salt Fork in Comanche County. The first was Wiley Payne's. In 35 years, Edward Wiley Payne had risen from poverty to become a respectable and wealthy rancher. Payne had developed a reputation of strict business sense and honesty that gave him one of the best one-owner operations within the Comanche pool. His peers in the pool elected him their first president, and he was so widely respected and trusted that he eventually became the ranch's banker in Medicine Lodge. His success was due greatly to the strength of his character, combined with hard work and good luck. Unfortunately, his luck turned the day the Cheyenne came to visit. As one of the pool's owners, he maintained his own herd and helped with about 15 other large cattle herds on both sides of the Arkansas Salt Fork. Payne's dugout ranch headquarters protruded from a red hill directly above the Salt Fork's north bank, only a few miles from where Bristow and Clark had met their doom. It was also only about 8 miles from Turkey Springs, which lay just over the ridge line to the south. Payne had built several corrals and an adequate shelter for his family. The dugout was no ordinary hovel, but was lined in cedar and even had a glass window in the front to let in light and air. The front door was of stout wooden planks for security. His nearest neighbor was William Colcord, whose near-identical dugout had been built a mile or so away up the creek at the mouth of Jugmont Creek. Evansville, the main corrals for the Comanche Pool in 1878, lay about 12 miles to the northeast. Only recently had Payne moved his family out to the ranch from Medicine Lodge. Evansville, officially the headquarters of the Comanche Pool Ranch, boasted a small store and had an official post office inside the ranch's White House. Several big cattle pens surrounded the ranch house. The recent infusion of John Chisholm's Jingle Bob cattle, brought in by Hunter and Evans, America's largest cattle-buying firm from New Mexico, to the ranges around Evansville, had boosted the Comanche Pool Ranch to national recognition. Dull Knife's raid would mark the beginning of the end for the Comanche Pool Ranch, the end of good luck for Payne and Colcord, and by coincidence, marked the beginning of a rapid decline of the cattle driving industry in the United States. About sunrise on Friday the 13th, the day the 4th Cavalry came under attack in Turkey Creek, and about an hour before Bristow and Clark were killed, Payne walked out the front door of his dugout to attend to his barnyard chores. Behind him came his brother, Walter Payne, 4 years younger and just recently returned from California. Payne's 15-year-old son, Charles, trailed along beside the two men. At the corral, Payne and his brother began feeding the saddle horses and mules and getting them ready for the day's work. Charles took a bucket and began milking a cow. Payne's wife, Susan, walked outside carrying Nora, their baby girl. In the cool, dry morning air of the Kansas frontier, the pioneer woman lay the baby in her crib outside the door and waited for Charles to bring her the cow's milk. Charles soon brought up the bucket, filled the butter churn with the fresh milk, and went back to help his father. Susan, gripping the handle with both hands, began pumping the churn up and down, following the exquisitely slow process of making butter by hand. Every morning Susan churned butter this way for an hour or so, stopping now and then to nurse the baby. The dugout faced east, and the sun's rays fell directly in her eyes. Suddenly she stiffened and stopped churning as shadows flicked in front of the sun. Shading her eyes with her hand, Mrs. Payne observed two young Indian men walking across the yard, heading for the corral. Though they were not painted in war paint and carried no weapons in their hands, Mrs. Payne instantly screamed, yelling to Wiley, whose back was turned toward the newcomers. For an instant, the two Cheyenne were startled, glancing back at Susan and then at Wiley, Walter, and Charles. The young men smiled self-deprecatingly, and one walked forward toward Wiley, holding out his hands in friendship. As Susan stared at the two strangers, particles of dirt fell onto her knees. She twisted around and peeked over the edge of the roof, and saw 3 Cheyenne warriors striding down the roof toward her. Pulling a shotgun from under a blanket on the bench, she screamed again, grabbed the baby, and ran for her life. At the corral, the 2 young Cheyenne pulled scalping knives and leaped forward on Wiley and his brother. From the roof of the dugout, arrows flew toward the family. Susan was now halfway to the creek, carrying baby Nora in one arm and the shotgun in the other. One arrow struck Wiley Payne in the back of the neck as he wrestled with his attacker. Susan paused when she saw the arrow hit her husband. She stopped, turned around, and fired a blast from the shotgun in the direction of the intruders on the roof. The shotgun blast probably saved their lives. The warriors on the roof leaped to the side, and the two grappling with Wiley and Walter let go and dove behind cover. Still screaming, Susan ran toward the creek, cradling her child in the shotgun. Wiley, Walter, and Charles got up where they had fallen during the fight, and all 3 limped along behind her. Halting at the creek bank, Susan slowed and waited for the men. A second flight of arrows struck her and the baby, causing her to fall and drop the shotgun. Crawling down the creek bank with a missile stuck in her thigh, she frantically tugged at an arrow that had lodged in her baby's shoulder. Soon she was joined by her husband and son, Walter coming in at last. Huddling under an overhang, the family surveyed their wounds. All had been injured. Walter had lost most of his right thumb while struggling with the Cheyenne. Charles broke a leg leaping from the bank on a large rock. Wiley pulled the arrow from his neck, and he and Susan tended the baby. Stunned and hurting, but still alive, the Payne family huddled for an hour under the overhang with only their knives to fend off their attackers. Later, they would remember the fight as a long, drawn-out battle, but they eventually decided that from the time the shadow flitted across Susan's vision, only about 3 minutes passed before they gathered in the bed of the creek. When the family cautiously returned to their home, they found only a raging inferno where their house and buildings had been. The Cheyenne had systematically ransacked the dugout and dragged all furniture and clothing outside. The intruders took only a few items and then piled the rest together and set them on fire before riding off with the saddle horses and mules. The warriors carried away all arms and ammunition, including 3 rifles and pistols, and took clothing and food. Walter lost his new Sharps improved .40 caliber rifle and a new .40 caliber pistol, plus a set of new clothes, a fur hat, some silk handkerchiefs, chaps, saddle, and saddle pockets. Miraculously, not one of the Payne family died from their wounds. Wiley recovered quickly. For less than a week later, he volunteered to be one of Rindlebrock's scouts. For the next 3 days, the Cheyenne rampaged through Comanche and Clark counties, attacking cowboys, chasing travelers off the military road, and pinning down the relay station at soldiers' graves. All the while, they kept the 4th Cavalry off balance or pinned down. In spite of all the intense activity, no one rode to Fort Dodge or Dodge City to warn the populace that the Cheyenne were raiding the southern counties. Apparently, the Cheyenne had been so efficient at taking stock that all the cowboys who escaped being killed were left on foot, 50 to 60 miles from town. By Friday night, ranchers were aware that the normal flow of cowboys back and forth to headquarters had stopped. By Saturday morning, September 14, the various foremen began to suspect that something was seriously wrong. 3 of the bigger ranchers, Dennis Sheedy, Toby Driscoll, and William Quinlan, missed the routine contacts with their herdsmen and set out to find them. At Dodge City, a few travelers came in after passing along the military road from Camp Supply. They reported that, strangely, several cattle herds were scattered over the countryside with no herdsmen in sight. On Friday evening, the Dodge City stagecoach driver reported that he did not see the 2 large herds of sheep in southwest Clark County, which had been a routine sight for several months. By noon Saturday, ranch operations ceased and the owners began bringing in their outriders while organizing search parties to hunt for missing men and animals. Messengers were dispatched to Sun City and Medicine Lodge from Evansville to get more help for the search parties. They still did not know that the Cheyenne were in the area. By Saturday night, a grim picture began to emerge from the confusion. Sheedy's cowboys found his main camp destroyed and the wagons burned. Until late Sunday, the cattlemen were slow to understand the extent of the threat, thinking that they were the only ones affected. Sheedy, upon surveying his destroyed camp, decided the damage had been caused by a small group of renegade Indians, perhaps a party of Osage. They had long raided the area. Other ranchers were prone to blame white outlaws, desperate men who hid southeast of Salt Springs in Indian territory. By Sunday noon, however, the separate search parties began to encounter each other, and it began to dawn on the men that they were facing a major Indian attack. Counting up their missing men and herds, the cattlemen were stunned to discover how widespread the raiding had been. From the attack on Payne on the Salt Fork to the east, the Indians had killed men as far west as Kyger Creek, about 35 miles away. Alarmed, the ranchers dispatched riders to warn all the ranch headquarters and the towns of Sun City and Medicine Lodge. The combined search parties began sweeping a vastly enlarged area, looking for a dozen or more missing herdsmen. By Sunday noon, in Clark County alone, the searchers had found 7 cattle camps and 2 sheep camps destroyed. The last attack had come just a few hours before the search party arrived. Sheedy and Quinlan sent for help from the Comanche Pool headquarters at Evansville. Amazingly, no one made any effort to contact the Army at Fort Dodge or Camp Supply, let alone warn the citizens at Dodge City. All day Sunday, the ranchers gathered and organized a local defense. Most went to Sheedy's headquarters in Clark County, while those further east met at Evansville in Comanche County. Their first priority was to collect sufficient weapons and ammunition to have some chance of success against the Indians. Women and children were rushed off to town. The isolated dugouts all over the range were soon abandoned. Ironically, almost at the exact moment the cowboys noticed there were Indian raiders in their midst, the raiding ended. Only 2 more southern Kansas men were destined to die at the hands of the Cheyenne. One was a postman. The other was a black cook. As dramatically as they had appeared, by Monday night the Cheyenne vanished from Clark County. There were probably many small parties of warriors there, of course, but they went into hiding as the whole area, Barber, Comanche, and Clark counties, came to a high state of alert. By Monday morning, only Meade County to the west, with its minuscule population of 2 or 3 ranches and 1 road ranch, remained blissfully unaware. That morning, Monday, September 16, the Cheyenne dramatically changed their method of operations. From now on in southern Kansas, except for an instance or two of opportunistic looting that were too good to pass up, the Cheyenne strictly avoided contact with the ranchers. For 3 days they had gone all out, grabbing horses, mules, and guns, killing and smashing anyone unfortunate enough to stand in their way. It was as if at first they were driven by the fear that they would fail to collect enough horses or fail to feed their families. When they had enough collected, they stopped raiding. Altogether, they had gathered at least 14 rifles, 5 shotguns, and 15 pistols, plus a considerable amount of ammunition and powder. They had killed 7 cowboys, destroyed 7 cattle camps and 2 sheep camps, burned 2 wagons and 2 dugouts. Not only had they ravaged the ranchers, but they had thrown back Rindlebrock's battalion. Completely refreshed over the weekend, they had enough weapons, horses, and food to attack the army whenever it reappeared. A new strategy was developed. They decided to keep the cavalry chasing them around the canyons of Clark County. This was a good area for fighting, plus it kept the soldiers distracted and far away from the Cheyenne families. On Monday morning, some 30 miles south of Clark County, Rindlebrock and his men staggered toward Fort Supply. Meanwhile, in the north, a long line of Cheyenne men and women emerged from the grassy crater of the Big Basin and followed Dullknife and Pathfinder due west into a series of small canyons and creek beds. Boys herded the captured horses, mules, and cattle off to one side. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Dullknife and his wards had crossed 12 miles of prairie west of the Big Basin and approached Hoodoo Brown's newly established 3-building settlement, or road ranch. This was Meade City, about 2 months old and carefully sited, at a day's travel from either end of the Jones-Plummer Trail, which ran between Tascosa in the Texas Panhandle and Dodge City. Dullknife boldly rode toward 2 white men, smiling on the open ground between the 3 buildings. Standing on the open ground between the 3 buildings. Heavily engaged in conversation, the white men did not look up at their guests until the first Cheyenne came to a halt around them. Their conversation stopped in mid-sentence, the speaker stunned into silence. Standing as if statues, the 2 white men looked around and noticed that behind the leading warriors, at least 100 mounted Indians moved in and surrounded them. Dullknife stopped his horse and threw down his hat, which landed at the feet of C.M. Cook. Cook, the manager of Brown's grocery store, had been talking to Ford County Deputy Sheriff A.J. French. He looked up apprehensively at the old chief. From inside one of the stores, clerk Frank Huff stared in astonishment at the 100 mounted Cheyenne gathered on the street. In English, the old man chief asked Cook to hand over some provisions to his people so they could eat. Cook instantly agreed and turned over everything he could carry, including 2 quarters of beef, a sack of flour, coffee, and other items. In an eerie spirit of faux goodwill, several dog soldiers and Elks hopped down, laughing, and counted coup on the white men by shaking their hands. After a while, the faked friendliness grew tiresome for some of the warriors. One Cheyenne abruptly seized French's pistol from his belt. Other Cheyenne kicked open the doors of the various buildings and went inside, looking for more food and booty. Before any harm came to the white men, and before Huff was discovered, the old Cheyenne halted the looting and signaled for them to return to their horses. Dullknife turned and rode away. The women and children followed. Lagging behind, shielding the women and children, at least a dozen adult warriors moved slowly away from the buildings, watching the stores for signs of danger. These men paused about 100 yards west of town, turned their ponies around, and sat watching for several moments. Frightened out of his wits by the encounter, Cook belatedly attempted to count the Cheyenne. His number of 230 was probably fairly accurate, but he drastically overestimated the number of men. He claimed seeing over 100 warriors when there could have been no more than about 40. Most of the veterans must have been watching the 4th Cavalry or scouting Fort Dodge and Camp Supply. The cattle and pony herd, unseen by Cook, French, or Huff, passed north of town. The strange truce of Meade City ended a mile west of town. As the trailing group of dog soldiers and young warriors turned to follow Dull Knife, they encountered the rural mailman heading up the trail in his buggy. Washington O'Connor, the local contract mail deliverer, was driving unhurriedly along when a Cheyenne brave leaped into the back of his conveyance. The warrior grabbed him by his hair and slashed his throat. Seconds later, O'Connor's team of horses was cut loose and driven away. Because the killing of O'Connor happened near Meade City and the 3 men in the town claimed they might be able to identify some of the warriors, the mailman's death would be selected by the Ford County prosecutors as the most winnable murder case against Dull Knife's warriors. By the time the Indians were available for the trial, however, only 7 warriors would still be alive. Dull Knife led the women and children down into the Crooked Creek canyons of northwestern Meade County. Finding a high-banked, thickly wooded horseshoe bend in the creek, the women and children were placed in a protected camp under a high bank. On the prairie above, seemingly flat land stretched endlessly away to the horizons. The land all around was treeless and flat, a thickly grassed prairie, part of the eastern region of the Great Plains. For hundreds of miles, to the west and south, the prairie stretched flat as a pancake, practically unnoticeable in an area that seemed to hold no such hiding places. The camp on Crooked Creek permitted the Cheyenne to rest unseen for the next several days. As the Army later found out, the camp and bluff on Crooked Creek could not be seen by a man on horseback even from less than a half-mile away. Meanwhile, Captain Hemphill and Company 1 had headed back to Bluff Creek, stopping at Mount Jesus, east of the military road in the north-central part of Clark County. Although the Cheyenne had crisscrossed the county for several days by now, the scouting patrols, including the legendary one-legged scout Amos Chapman, spent the afternoon finding nothing. At nightfall, Hemphill remained blissfully ignorant, camping within a few miles of 6 dead cowboys, one of them less than a mile off to the northeast on Cavalry Creek. Hemphill still was unaware that Rindlebrock's battalion had been defeated and had retreated toward Camp Supply. While he camped, the main body of Cheyenne women and children left the Big Basin and headed west. Meanwhile, Dull Knife's scouts observed Hemphill's every move. When it grew dark, Hemphill, always nervous, ordered his men to stay battle-ready and hold their saddled horses all night. And it might have been Company I. I don't know if they called it Company I or Company 1, but it's a capital I, so I called it Company 1. And if so, it's my mistake if it's actually called Company I. It was 2 o'clock Monday morning when Hemphill became aware of the Cheyenne. A sentry rattled the camp with a set of loud challenges. Sergeants leapt to their feet, shouting orders for the soldiers to load their carbines. Running to the sentry, Hemphill saw a single white man, covered with dried mud, emerging from the brush along Bluff Creek. The disheveled character introduced himself as Cimarron Bates and said he had hidden for 2 days in the brush along the creek. After being handed some cold rations, Bates described the attack on Sheedy's camp. For the first time, Hemphill knew for certain that the Cheyenne were raiding in Clark County. Hemphill gave orders to mount up, and the soldiers moved out toward Sheedy's camp. Bates begged for one of the extra pack animals. Given a mule to ride, Bates led Hemphill to the destroyed camp and then turned his mount toward the northwest and Fort Dodge. The same night that Bates rode for Dodge City, Little Wolf and a dozen men left Dull Knife and circled north out of Meade County toward the area known as the Cimarron crossing of the Arkansas River. Little Wolf intended to inspect the fords along the river and scout for any soldiers there. When he neared the river, the Cheyenne spotted the lights of a campfire near one of the crossings. Quietly, the dozen veteran Cheyenne walked into the light where 3 buffalo hunters sat, busily cleaning their weapons for another day's hunt. No one said a word as the Cheyenne sat down around the hunters. Behind the whites, a dugout had been carved from the bank of a tributary creek. This was about a mile southwest of the present town of Cimarron, only 16 miles west of Dodge City. Calmly, Little Wolf spread a blanket on the ground in front of the white men and motioned Driscoll brothers arrived at the DeCross Ranch headquarters that afternoon, they were relieved to find everything was still intact and undamaged. Back up the creek, which is now named for him, Day was shown the body of a Cheyenne warrior. J.E. George reported he shot the man off a horse near Bluff Creek while being chased by several warriors. After outrunning the Cheyenne, George led several Day cowboys back to the area and recovered the body. Day sent George out to find and bring back the cavalry, which he knew were in the area somewhere, and ordered the men to bury Black Beaver's body far up the creek, away from the headquarters, reasoning that if the warriors found the body, they would start a vengeance attack. Later that day, Lieutenants Wood, Wilder, and McDonald, with 28 troopers of Companies G and H, found Hemphill and Company I in the central part of Clark County. Since the other companies are alphabetized, G and H, I should believe it's pronounced Company I. So, the lieutenants find Company I in the central part of Clark County. A few moments after they had joined Hemphill, J.E. George spotted them. He described them as two companies of soldiers of about 80 men. George was nearly correct in his count. Counting Hemphill's 36 soldiers and 2 officers, plus 28 men from Companies G and H, and their 3 officers, there were 64 troopers, 5 officers, and 9 scouts, a total of 78 horsemen, who were parts of 3 cavalry companies, G, H, and I. George rode up to Hemphill and described the attacks, of which he was aware. He said that Doc Day wanted him to come down to the ranch on Day Creek. Hemphill agreed to follow him. Arriving at Driscoll's, Doc Day showed the officers Black Beaver's body and let George describe the attack. George and 10 to 12 cattlemen joined the soldiers, while Doc Day and others rode out to hunt cattle. The cavalry ended up Day Creek and the cavalry returned up Day Creek and camped at Mount Jesus. By the time it grew dark, other reports of Cheyenne raiding parties came in from the Dodge City cattlemen. These reports unnerved Hemphill. He sent a messenger to Lieutenant Colonel Lewis at Fort Dodge, asking for more support. Even though his force now approached 100 guns, Hemphill remained fearful of a surprise attack. He kept the horses saddled and ordered his men to hold the reins all night. Off to the east in Comanche County that morning, Charles Colcord rode out of Sun City with Kinchlow, another cowboy. They headed across the wide grasslands toward Evansville. The 2 men met one of their own, a Jug Ranch cowboy named Pat Gallagher, who was riding a herd from the other direction. Gallagher excitedly told Colcord that some Indians had broken out of Indian territory and were killing everyone in the county. Men were reported dead over in Clark County as well as in Comanche County. He claimed several Comanche pool men had been wounded and were being taken to headquarters at Evansville. Leaving Gallagher to speed off to Sun City to warn the residents and beg medical aid, Colcord and Kinchlow raced their horses toward Colcord's dugout. Both were terrified of what they might find. Kinchlow said if the dogs were out and about when they approached, all would be fine, because Indians always killed the dogs when they raised a homestead. As Colcord and Kinchlow crossed the Salt Fork, they suddenly halted, seeing several strangely dressed men in the camp several hundred yards distant. The standing figures were acting unnaturally. It was the middle of the day, yet these men were gathered around a fire. Thinking they might be the Indians, Colcord and Kinchlow crept forward through the tall stem grass until they could clearly see the camp inside a grove of big elm trees. They were astonished. The men were wearing suits and expensive riding clothes. They looked to be overdressed young English gentlemen. Shouting into the camp, the cowboys walked in and told them that the Cheyenne were on the loose. After introductions all around, the men politely said they were from Old Runnymede. This was an elite hunting and farming colony set up in south-central Kansas, from which the wealthy British heir could experience the frontier with all the comforts to which he was entitled. Colcord admonished the Englishmen to flee for their lives, but he could tell the arrogant youths were amused by the cowboys and would Less than an hour